From the Toronto Star, I'm Sabah Itazaz, and this matters. Before you hit that add to cart button, we need to talk about Amazon. For most of us, our only interaction with Amazon and similar online platforms these days is clicking on stuff, proceeding to checkout, and then expecting it to appear in the time frame given. And if you're an Amazon Prime member, for instance, you know you're getting what they promised: free one-day shipping or a few days at most. It's a promise built on speed, ease, and convenience. But for you, not many of us have thought about the person on the other end getting our holiday shopping to us, the one who might be paying the true price of that promise, as a new Star investigation has revealed. Today, the reporter behind the investigation for the Star, Sarah Mushtahedzadeh, is on This Matters to talk about that and the plight of low-wage temporary warehouse workers who were not very protected even before a deadly global pandemic. Hi, Sarah. Thank you for joining me again.
Thanks for having me.
Sarah, first tell me a little bit about the Amazon operations in Canada. How extensive are they?
Yeah, Amazon has a big presence in Canada. They employ 21,000 people across the country, across all of their operations. And we know, obviously, that warehouses are central to those operations because it's where all of the millions of items that Canadians order have to be processed through in order to get to their final destination. This year alone, I believe Amazon announced that it was building 2 more of those facilities in Ajax and Hamilton. So it's definitely a big presence and an expanding presence as well.
And from a business perspective, how has this pandemic affected the company and its bottom line, as most of us are relying more and more on online retail?
Yeah, and I think we've definitely seen that in terms of Amazon's financial success. Their profits this year globally have tripled. They are one of the most, if not the most, valuable companies in the entire world. So obviously, as we've sort of struggled through lockdowns, a lot of people have turned to delivery now more than ever to get the items that they need and try and reduce risk in terms of exposure to COVID. And, the warehouses and delivery people who are making that happen are absolutely an essential workforce.
And that means more and more challenges for them as well. Now, this is not the first time issues around Amazon workers' safety and health and the conditions there have come up. We've been seeing this ongoing on similar issues in the United States as well. But what I didn't know was that things might actually be worse in Canada. What is similar and what is different? Do we have a bigger problem here?
Yeah, so our investigation sort of looked into that exact question, and we looked at injury rates across Canadian warehouses over the past 4 years. And these are injuries that are recorded by Amazon itself. So the data comes from internal safety records that were obtained by a U.S. investigative outlet called Reveal that's reported extensively on this in the United States. And so what that data allows us to do is to have a common injury metric that Amazon uses across all of its facilities in Canada and the United States so that we can compare what is going on in the different warehouses. And when you look at the overall average injury rates at Canadian warehouses, they are higher. They're 15% higher than the American average. And actually in 2016, the company's facility in Delta, BC had the highest injury rate across Canada and the United States. So there's certainly a significant injury problem that is showing up in Amazon's own accounting of what is happening inside its warehouses.
And I was reading this in your article as well. I'd like for you to tell us, Sarah, what is the discrepancy between Amazon's official or public records and what you've seen internally?
Yeah, so it's interesting in Canada because the way we report injuries is different than in the US. So the internal safety records that we obtained, they conform to the American reporting standards. And in the US, sort of higher level data coming from that internal recording would be sent to their Department of Labor and be made public by the Department of Labor. And you can do a search of, what the injury rate for a particular employer is. Here in Canada, a company's injury rate is determined by the number of accepted workers' compensation claims in whatever province the employer is in. So it's a bit of a different process because not only does the company need to keep track of the injuries that are happening in their workplace, but they need to report it to the compensation board, and then the compensation board has to accept it as being a work-related injury. And, over the past few years, I've covered a lot of the barriers that workers face in terms of getting those compensation claims proved. So, there's definitely been criticism from labor advocates that the public-facing injury rates that we see in Ontario and other provinces sometimes are not capturing what is happening inside workplaces.
How has COVID-19 further impacted workers who are putting themselves at risk so the rest of us can stay home?
Well, I think generally speaking, we've seen the enormous toll on frontline workers. A while back, I looked at some of the workers' compensation data that we do have, and not surprisingly, we saw farm workers and healthcare workers, really bearing the brunt of those COVID cases. But I think in terms of Amazon, the short answer is we don't really know, because one of the big struggles of this pandemic has been a lack of transparency around where outbreaks are happening. And it's been really difficult to kind of prove or establish which workplaces and which types of workplaces are seeing the biggest impact on their workforce. Amazon would not comment on the number of COVID cases within its warehouses across Canada. But to give one example, I was able to confirm at least 25 cases in one of its Brampton warehouses alone. So
in just one?
Just one. So we know that, workers are testing positive for the virus. We don't know on what scale in Canada. Amazon says that it wouldn't be useful data to provide because there's so many other factors to consider, like, what are the community rates, infection rates in the places where the warehouses are located. But we do know in the United States, they did go public with the number of infections. And in the US, there were over 19,000 Amazon workers who tested positive for the virus. So we do sort of have a sense of the scale of people getting sick in the United States, but not so much in Canada.
Sarah, did the company change its workplace safety policy to keep its workers safe from COVID-19 risks? Because from what we're talking about and what we've been seeing, we're still seeing these spiking health and injury rates, right?
Yeah, so injury rates have definitely been increasing according to Amazon's own internal records since 2016. In the GTA, the injuries have more than doubled. In terms of what happened when COVID hit, at the start of the pandemic, I reported on many of the concerns faced by Amazon workers in the kind of initial stages of lockdown. There were concerns that Amazon didn't move fast enough to, cancel these enormous group meetings that they'd have at the start of every shift, that there wasn't enough access to personal protective gear. Since then, I think some of those things have improved, according to some of the workers that I've spoken to, but there are still definitely concerns. One of them is the lack of paid sick days for temporary employees. One warehouse I was able to get some information on, 40% of its staff by the end of November were temporary, obviously trying to cope with a spike in holiday ordering. For those workers, it becomes a choice of, do I miss a day's work and a day's income, or do I risk going in with the sniffles? And so there's certainly concern around that. There's concern, I think, fundamentally about the speed and pressure that workers are put under in these facilities, and that fundamentally makes it hard for them to stay safe, whether it be from injury or illness, because the overwhelming focus is just getting those goods out the door. The production rates that they are expected to hit are very difficult. Sometimes, scanning up to 200 boxes an hour. And so I think that fundamental piece is what troubles a lot of workers.
We'll be right back. you've obviously gleaned that from talking to some current and former workers at Amazon. What else does it say about the work culture and what it was or is like working there?
Again, I think it's this overwhelming focus on productivity and the way that workers are so closely surveyed to ensure that they're hitting these productivity targets. For workers who end up in the bottom 5% of performers, they become the target of discipline that can eventually lead to termination. Some of the internal emails I saw showed, certain departments singling out workers 3 times a shift for being too slow. Their every movement pretty much is under surveillance. At the end of the day, their scanner tracks how much time off task they've taken, which is any time outside of their sort of lunch breaks that aren't spent scanning items. And again, there can be disciplinary measures if you spend too much time being quote unquote idle. And so that sort of culture of speed and productivity, workers said, was very difficult to deal with. It made workers feel like they were disposable, like they had to work through injuries in order to keep up with the required pace. And I think, there's just definitely a tension there between the safety measures that Amazon has implemented. They have invested in COVID precautions. They have invested in injury precautions, but that is fighting with this other key piece of their business, which is delivering packages to their customers in a, extremely efficient and speedy way.
That's the business model that Amazon has, right? The need for speed and productivity. And that kind of plays into how they might deal with workers' rights and claims, right?
Yeah, they describe themselves as being customer obsessed. They want to be the most customer centric company on earth. These are, statements that they've made publicly and are key to who they are. And, we, as consumers, people love that. Of course, everyone wants to, be able to easily place an order and have it delivered to their doorstep. You can see why that's appealing. I think what workers are saying is it's just important to be mindful that there is a cost to that. And perhaps there could be a healthier balance between that kind of need for speed and the need to keep workers safe.
And in your article, you also talk about how the tech giant is fighting injury claims by workers in a way which can be seen as almost aggressive. Tell me more about that, and why might Amazon be doing this?
Yeah, so our investigation found through a Freedom of Information request to the Compensation Board here in Ontario that when injury reports are filed to report workplace injuries and accidents, in almost 80% of cases where the injury was severe and the worker needed to take time off work, Amazon disputed or sought to undermine the legitimacy of the claim. So they would say things like the worker had a pre-existing condition, or they didn't report the injury in a timely fashion, or that there was no proof that there was ever an accident. Basically, it's a way for employers to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the injury and suggest that the injury is less severe than the worker is saying or reporting. And the reason why employers do this, and to be clear, it's not just Amazon, although they are on the more aggressive end of the spectrum. It's a strategy that employers use to reduce the costs associated with a workplace accident. So if you can successfully argue that this injury was not so serious that the worker couldn't come into work and that you were able to offer them a modified job that worked with whatever injury they had, then that doesn't become officially counted as a serious injury. And so your costs at the Workers' Compensation Board are not going to go up. So there's a financial incentive to dispute the severity of the injury claims that workers are making.
And to just kind of put this into scale from your piece, you were talking about the official records that suggest that Amazon actually fought almost 80% of Ontario's serious injury claims in 2018, 2019, right?
Yeah, that's right. And I asked several lawyers who have decades of experience working with the Workers' Compensation Board and injured workers, and they described that rate of objection or casting doubt on injury claims as aggressive. It is a way for employers, whether they be Amazon or any other employer with an interest in keeping their accident costs low, to try and manage the financial impact of a workplace injury. And, there's nothing illegal in doing that, but for workers, it can mean an uphill battle in terms of getting the compensation that they potentially need in order to recover.
And we've seen several employees fired earlier this year as well, employees who say they were terminated for speaking out on similar issues. Then the VP, Tim Bray, resigned, and I believe you spoke to him. Did he talk about what looks like a culture of silence and sort of fear of keeping your job at the company? What did he talk about?
Yeah, so Tim Bray is a really interesting character. He is a Canadian business person and engineer who was a senior vice president at Amazon Web Services and spoke to me as part of my investigation. And he ended up quitting this summer over 6 warehouse whistleblowers in the US losing their jobs after they spoke out about COVID concerns. And he wrote what is now a very public condemnation, basically, of what happened there, and sort of pointed to the need to listen to workers when they say they don't feel safe. And I think he made some really interesting points, because I think his perspective is that in many ways, Amazon is a very well-managed company, especially if you're a white-collar worker. It's a great place to work. It's very well structured. It has clear goals. But again, there is a cost to that. And the cost from his perspective is being borne by these low-wage, precarious warehouse employees who don't have the same power to speak up when they're concerned about working conditions. And his point was, this isn't just an Amazon problem. Amazon is a symptom of the problem, which is that it's getting harder and harder for low-wage, precarious workers across Canada and the United States to exercise some very basic rights in the workplace. And that's a systemic issue. Amazon is sort of a glaring example of that, but it's not the only example.
Definitely a look at the bigger picture here seems to be needed. Sarah, how important have Canadian unions been in workplace checks and balances during the pandemic? I wanted to know, are Amazon workers unionized, or what kind of protections are available to them? Where can workers get help?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Working in an Amazon warehouse is sort of the modern day equivalent in many ways of a blue-collar job from the 1950s or 60s, which would have been, working in an auto plant or something like that in Southern Ontario. The big difference is that those jobs were mostly unionized. And for those workers, they meant, a job for life, and they meant a pension and benefits and a union and job security. And that's a transformation that has happened across our entire economy, that it's harder and harder for people to find those kinds of jobs. Amazon warehouses are not unionized. They've sort of responded to public pressure in some ways, like they've committed to a $15 minimum wage in the US and a $16 minimum wage in Canada. But they've also been exposed in the US for really creating an atmosphere, I would say, of hostility toward union efforts, union drives. And I think when you're talking about low-wage workers who are often new Canadians that are staffing these warehouses and the most powerful company on earth, what I heard from workers is that it's just really hard to advocate for yourself in that environment. And that's, I think, for them where a union potentially comes in as someone who can advocate on your behalf, who, if you have an injury claim, can help you deal with the fallout of that. As it stands, workers are pretty much on their own.
And we've seen the U.S. Labor Department sort of take this issue up across the border. Do we have any government oversight on this in Canada? Who holds the company accountable?
Yeah, in the US, I think it's become much more of a kind of wedge issue. We saw Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren really kind of leading the charge and talking publicly about Amazon's practices and precarious work more generally. We haven't seen the same kind of narrative here in Canada, but I think that conversation about whether our overall standards are strong enough is a huge part of the fallout of the pandemic, because we've seen so many frontline workers raise concerns about basic safety protections, about income support, all of these issues that make it very difficult to be a low wage worker in Canada. So I think that those conversations are happening. There's a few layers of accountability that the Ministry of Labor has a role in holding employers accountable to ensure that their workplaces are safe. But policymakers also have a role in setting basic standards and passing legislation that, lifts the boat for everyone, not just targeting Amazon, but for all workers who find themselves in lower wage, precarious jobs.
And like you said, these conversations have started, and we have talked about similar issues before as well, Sarah. It seems like, once again, the pandemic is showing us just how exploitative conditions can be for low-wage workers doing precarious work and warehouse workers like you're talking about. It says a lot about our system and society, and it's good that we've started talking about this now.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's going to be a big takeaway from the pandemic, is that a lot of these jobs are really invisible. We don't see what's happening in warehouses or, industrial settings. We don't really have an inside look at what those realities are like. And I think that the pandemic has sort of forced us to take a closer look at that and reconsider what we consider to be the bare minimum protection that we should be affording workers.
Hopefully there's lessons to be learned from this. Thank you so much for your time and insight, Sarah.
Thank you.
I was talking to Sarah Mustahedzadeh. She's the Star's Work and Wealth reporter. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Sabah Itazaz, Adrian Chung, and Raju Mutter. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.